September 17th, 1348. Krakow, Poland. When city guards broke down the door of the plague doctor's residence in the Jewish quarter, they expected to find a corpse. What they found instead were cages. Dozens of wooden cages stacked floor to ceiling, each one teeming with rats. But these weren't ordinary vermin fleeing the plague-ravaged streets. These rats were marked, tagged with colored threads around their necks: red for the cloth merchants' district, blue for the cathedral square, yellow for the noble houses along Grodzka Street. In the corner, a leather-bound journal lay open. The last entry, dated 2 days prior, read, "Subject 47 released near the Wawel Bakery. Symptoms manifest within 3 days. The pattern holds. God forgive me, but the pattern always holds." But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in medieval Krakow could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Krakow plague doctor's rats, how a trusted healer deliberately weaponized the Black Death and trained rodents to spread disease throughout medieval Poland, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. The year 1348 marked the apex of medieval Europe's darkest chapter. The Black Death had already consumed Constantinople, swept through Italy, and was now devouring Central Europe with the hunger of a biblical apocalypse. In Krakow, one of the great trading cities of the Polish kingdom, the plague arrived not with warning bells but with whispers. Rumors from merchants traveling the Silk Road, tales from Venetian traders who'd seen entire villages emptied in a fortnight. Krakow in 1348 was a city of contrasts and contradictions. King Casimir III, known as the Great, had transformed the settlement into a thriving medieval metropolis. Stone churches replaced wooden chapels. The city's charter, granted just decades earlier, had attracted German merchants, Jewish scholars, and craftsmen from across Europe. The main market square bustled with commerce: textile dealers from Flanders, spice merchants from the east, and local farmers selling grain that fed the city's 15,000 souls. But prosperity bred paranoia. The social fabric of Krakow was taut with tension. The Polish nobility resented the growing influence of German burghers. The Catholic Church viewed the thriving Jewish community with suspicion. And beneath it all, the peasantry, crammed into wooden tenements beyond the city walls, lived one failed harvest away from starvation. Into this powder keg walked Dr. Marius Vogel. Vogel had appeared in Krakow during the spring of 1347, arriving with impeccable credentials from the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's premier medical schools. He was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and gaunt, with the pale complexion of a man who spent his days in libraries rather than sunlight. He wore the distinct Tive costume of plague doctors that would later become infamous: a leather coat waxed to repel miasma, gloves that reached past the elbows, and that peculiar beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs believed to filter poisoned air. The city council, desperate for medical expertise as plague reports grew more frequent, welcomed him enthusiastically. They provided him with a spacious residence in the Jewish quarter, ironically one of the more hygienic parts of the city due to Jewish religious laws about cleanliness, and granted him access to the city hospital attached to the Franciscan monastery. Vogel quickly established himself as a physician of remarkable dedication. He visited the sick at all hours, never refusing a call regardless of the patient's ability to pay. He gave lectures to local barber surgeons about the importance of quarantine and proper disposal of contaminated materials. He corresponded with physicians in Vienna and Prague, sharing observations about the plague's progression. City records show the council paid him 30 groszy annually, a generous salary that reflected their appreciation. But there were oddities, though few noticed them at the time. Vogel kept unusual hours, often seen before dawn walking near the city walls, carrying a leather satchel. He purchased peculiar items from the market, not just medicinal herbs, but large quantities of grain, bacon fat, and wooden cages typically used by fowlers. His servant, a mute bohemian named Jakob, was observed making frequent trips to the city's waste pits, returning with sealed barrels whose contents remained mysterious. Most peculiar of all was Vogel's obsession with rats. While other physicians focused on balancing humors and bleeding patients, Vogel spent hours observing the vermin that infested every medieval city. He paid street children to capture rats alive, offering a copper coin for each healthy specimen delivered to his residence. When questioned about this strange hobby by fellow physicians, Vogel explained it was part of his research into how disease spread through communities. He believed the answer lay in understanding God's smallest creatures. The people of Krakow, desperate for any hope against the approaching pestilence, found his eccentricities charming rather than alarming. After all, what did they know of scientific method? If this learned doctor from France believed rats held secrets about the plague, who were they to question him? By winter's arrival in 1347, the first confirmed cases of plague appeared in Krakow. A merchant who'd traded in Wroclaw fell ill with the characteristic buboes, painful swellings in the groin and armpits that gave the Black Death its medical name. Within 3 days he was dead. His wife followed within the week, then their children. The city braced for catastrophe. Churches filled with desperate prayers. The Jewish community fasted and increased their ritual purifications. The city council enacted quarantine measures, closing the GA. Tests to travelers from infected regions and establishing pest houses outside the walls where the sick could be isolated, and Dr. Marius Vogel worked tirelessly, moving from house to house, offering what comfort medicine could provide in an age before antibiotics or even basic germ theory. He seemed to be everywhere, at the bedsides of dying nobles, in the crowded tenements where whole families succumbed together, at the pest houses where the afflicted were left to live or die according to God's will. No one yet realized that wherever Dr. Vogel walked, death followed with peculiar precision. The first pattern emerged in late January 1348, though it would be months before anyone connected the dots. A baker named Piotr Kowalski, whose shop stood on the corner of Florianska Street, fell ill on the morning of January 23rd. His symptoms followed the classic progression: fever, weakness, then the telltale buboes erupting in his groin. He died within 4 days. Tragic, but not unusual in a city battling plague. What was unusual was the speed with which his entire neighborhood succumbed. Within 10 days of Kowalski's death, 17 residents of Florianska Street were dead, and another 30 showed symptoms. City records from the time note that Dr. Vogel had visited Kowalski's shop 3 days before the baker fell ill, ostensibly to purchase bread for his household. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing Vogel's servant, Jacob, loitering near the baker's shop around the same time, carrying one of those mysterious sealed barrels. The second incident occurred in early March, targeting the noble district near Wawel Castle. Count Stanislaw Tarnowski, a member of King Casimir's inner circle and an outspoken critic of increased taxation to fund plague measures, hosted a feast on March 8th. It was a defiant celebration, an assertion that the nobility would not cower before disease like common peasants. Within 48 hours of that feast, Count Tarnowski was dead. His wife, 2 children, 3 servants, and 7 dinner guests followed him to the grave within the next week. The royal physician, Dr. Zbigniew Ostrowski, performed what passed for an autopsy in medieval times. His report, preserved in the royal archives, noted something peculiar. The count's chamber was infested with rats to an unusual degree. His servants reported the vermin had appeared suddenly, the night of the feast, as though emerging from the very walls. Dr. Vogel had attended at feast. Records show he'd been invited by the count's wife, who'd been impressed by his treatment of her mother during a minor illness. Vogel had spent considerable time touring the castle, ostensibly admiring its architecture, including areas near the kitchens and cellars where food was stored. The third incident proved even more troubling to those few who were beginning to notice a pattern. The Cathedral of Saints Stanislaus and Wenceslaus, Krakow's grandest church, had remained largely untouched by plague through the winter. Bishop Florian took this as a sign of divine favor, evidence that faith provided protection against pestilence. He publicly criticized the quarantine measures, arguing they showed lack of faith in God's mercy. On April 3, 1348, the bishop collapsed during Easter Mass. The buboes appeared within hours, an unusually rapid onset that puzzled physicians. Within a week, 43 people who'd attended that Easter service were dead, including 12 priests and the cathedral's entire choir. A young priest named Father Andrzej, who survived the outbreak through sheer luck, he'd been delayed arriving to Mass, later testified to investigators about something strange he'd witnessed. 2 nights before Easter, unable to sleep, he'd gone to the cathedral to pray in the quiet hours before dawn. There he'd seen Dr. Vogel's mute servant, Jacob, in the church sacristy where the priest's vestments were stored. When questioned, Jacob had gestured that he was looking for Dr. Vogel, who he claimed had left his medical bag in the church days earlier. Father Andrzej found this explanation odd. He'd been present at every Mass that week and didn't recall seeing Dr. Vogel at all. But he was a trusting soul, and Jacob's muteness made lengthy interrogation impossible. The servant departed with apologies conveyed through gestures, and Father André thought little more of it, until the plague struck with such devastating force. The fourth incident shattered any remaining coincidence. The Jewish quarter, home to Krakow's thriving community of scholars and merchants, had experienced remarkably low plague mortality. Various theories explained this. Some said Jewish dietary laws and ritual washing provided protection. Others whispered darker explanations involving well poisoning, a common anti-Semitic libel during plague years. Dr. Vogel lived in the Jewish quarter. He'd developed friendships within the community, particularly with Rabbi Moshe ben Jacob, a learned man who'd engaged Vogel in philosophical discussions about medicine and faith. On May 12, 1348, Vogel visited the rabbi's home for Shabbat dinner, a mark of exceptional trust in an era when Jewish-Christian relations were strained at best. 4 days later, Rabbi Moshe was dead. The plague swept through the Jewish quarter with unprecedented fury. Within 3 weeks, more than 200 members of the Jewish community perished, a death rate far exceeding the proportion in Christian districts. The loss was catastrophic, destroying families and erasing generations of scholarship. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. The unraveling began with rats, specifically with the testimony of a 12-year-old street urchin named Tomasz, one of the children who'd been catching rats for Dr. Vogel's supposed research. On September 14, 1348, Tomasz appeared at the city council chamber. In a state of terror. He'd gone to Vogel's residence that morning to deliver 3 rats he'd trapped near the fish market. The doctor wasn't home, but the door stood ajar, unusual for a man as methodical as Vogel. Curious and emboldened by the doctor's absence, Tomasz had entered the house. What he found sent him running to the authorities. There were cages everywhere, Tomasz testified to the city recorder, stacked to the ceiling, hundreds of rats, maybe thousands. But these weren't normal rats, Your Honors. They had colored threads tied around their necks, and they were sick. I could see it. Some had these horrible swellings, just like people get. And Dr. Vogel had written labels on the cages, addresses, I think. I can't read well, but I recognize some of the words. Florianska Street, Walwell Castle, the cathedral. The city guard was dispatched immediately. Captain Wojciech Kowalski, ironically a cousin of the baker who died on Florianska Street, led 6 armed men to Vogel's residence. They found exactly what Tomasz had described, but in far more horrifying detail. The ground floor of the residence had been converted into a laboratory that would have seemed more at home in a future century than in medieval Krakow. Wooden tables were covered with glass vessels and copper instruments. Careful records documented every experiment. But most damning were the rats. Captain Kowalski's official report, preserved in the city archives, provides a chilling inventory. We counted 47 cages containing live rats in various states of health. An additional 19 cages contained dead specimens in different stages of decomposition. Each cage was labeled with a location within the city or a specific person's name. The rats bore colored threads according to a system we found documented in the doctor's journals: red for merchant districts, blue for religious buildings, yellow for noble residences, green for the Jewish quarter, black for the royal castle. In a locked chest we discovered vials containing what appeared to be blood and pus, presumably collected from plague victims. There were detailed anatomical drawings showing the progression of buboes. And there was correspondence, letters written in cipher that our scholars are still attempting to decode. Most damning of all was the journal lying open on his desk. That journal, now housed in the Jagiellonian University archives, provides a window into the mind of perhaps history's first bioterrorist. Written in a mixture of Latin, German, and coded language, it details a systematic campaign of deliberate plague infection spanning nearly 8 months. Key entries translated from the original, December 3, 1347. The methodology proves sound, by feeding infected tissue to captured rats, then releasing them near targeted granaries and food stores. I can predict with reasonable accuracy where the pestilence will strike. The rats, driven by hunger, seek out these locations naturally. The plague passes from rat to human through the fleas they carry. It is elegant in its simplicity. January 19, 1348, the baker Kowalski presents an ideal test subject. His shop's location at a major intersection will allow me to observe concentric spread patterns. Have prepared 6 subjects for release. Jacob will handle distribution during the night market when traffic is highest. March 6, 1348. Count Tarnowski's opposition to plague measures threatens the entire experiment. If the city implements effective quarantine and sanitation, my data collection will be compromised. The feast provides an opportunity. Castle cellars are poorly sealed, a perfect entry point. April 1st, 1348. The bishop's faith will be tested in ways his theology never anticipated. Have prepared the cathedral. Infiltration for Easter Mass. The symbolic significance pleases me, though I recognize this as weakness. Science should be divorced from emotion. May 10th, 1348. The Jewish quarter's resistance to plague has created variables I did not anticipate. Their sanitation practices may actually work to some degree. This requires controlled study. Rabbi Moshe's invitation provides the perfect opportunity to introduce infection directly into their community center. The journal contained dozens of such entries, each one documenting Vogel's systematic murder of hundreds, possibly thousands of Krakow citizens. But perhaps most chilling were his motivations, revealed in earlier entries. November 15, 1347. I have watched plague consume city after city with no logic, no predictability. Physicians stand helpless, offering prayers and useless remedies while people die in agony. But what if the plague could be controlled? What if one could direct it like a weapon or withhold it like a blessing? The knowledge would be worth any price. God has given me this opportunity to understand his judgment. I must not waste it through squeamishness. Dr. Marius Vogel wasn't driven by hatred or sadism. He was driven by the most dangerous motivation of all, the absolute conviction that his quest for knowledge justified any human cost. He'd transformed Krakow into a massive field laboratory, manipulating plague vectors to study disease transmission, patterns decades before germ theory would be discovered. When guards searched the upper floors, they found living quarters of monastic simplicity. A narrow bed, a prayer desk, shelves of medical texts. In a locked drawer, they discovered Vogel's true credentials. He had indeed studied at Montpellier, but he'd been expelled 3 years earlier for grave robbing and unauthorized dissection of executed criminals. His medical license had been revoked in France, Germany, and the Papal States. He'd fled to Poland using forged references, seeking a place where his reputation hadn't preceded him. The most disturbing discovery came from Jakob, the mute servant. When arrested, Jakob proved not to be mute at all. He'd simply been paid handsomely to maintain silence. Under interrogation, he revealed that he'd been a plague survivor himself, having lost his entire family in Munich. Vogel had recruited him with promises of preventing others from suffering the same fate, convincing him that the doctor's research would ultimately save lives by unlocking the secrets of plague transmission. He told me we were doing God's work, Jacob testified, weeping, that understanding the plague was the only way to defeat it. I believed him. God help me, I believed him until the very end. The manhunt for Dr. Marius Vogel became one of medieval Europe's most intensive pursuits. Captain Kowalski immediately sealed the city gates and posted guards at every exit. Heralds were dispatched to surrounding cities with descriptions of the fugitive plague doctor. King Casimir III, horrified by the revelation that plague had been deliberately unleashed in his favored city, offered a reward of 100 griseidiones, enough to buy a small estate, for Vogel's capture. But Vogel had vanished like smoke. Guards searching his residence found evidence of hasty departure, abandoned possessions, half-packed trunks, papers scattered across the floor. Analysis of his journal suggested he'd realized his operation was compromised. The final entry, dated September 13th, one day before young Tomasz discovered the rat cages, read simply, Jakob has become unreliable. Must relocate research to Vienna. The knowledge must not be lost. The investigation revealed Vogel's escape plan had been long prepared. He maintained a secondary residence outside the city walls, unknown to the council, where he'd stockpiled supplies and money. Witnesses came forward reporting they'd seen a tall man matching Vogel's description, departing through a little used postern gate on the evening of September 13th, traveling on horseback toward the Hungarian border. Pursuit parties tracked him as far as Krakow's southern territories, but there the trail went cold. Some reports placed him in Buda, others in Vienna. Still others claimed he'd fled to the Balkans. The truth remained elusive, and Vogel's ultimate fate became one of history's unsettling mysteries. No confirmed sightings ever surfaced, and no body was ever found. The legal proceedings against Jacob proved equally complex. Medieval law had no framework for prosecuting someone involved in biological warfare. The very concept didn't exist. Initially charged with murder, Jacob's defense argued he was merely following his master's orders under the belief they were conducting legitimate medical research. His obvious remorse and cooperation with investigators complicated matters further. The trial before the city council lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses testified about Jacob's visible distress during his final days working for Vogel, suggesting he'd begun to suspect the truth. His testimony provided crucial details about Vogel's methodology, how the rats were infected, where they were released, how Vogel tracked the resulting outbreaks to refine his techniques. The council ultimately convicted Jacob of conspiracy to murder and complicity in crimes against the city. However, recognizing his coercion and cooperation, they commuted the expected death sentence to permanent exile. On November 3, 1348, Jacob was escorted beyond Krakow's borders with strict orders never to return on pain of execution. He was last seen traveling northwest, reportedly making pilgrimage to various shrines seeking divine forgiveness. The broader investigation uncovered disturbing evidence of Vogel's international connections. Letters found in cipher, once decoded by university scholars, revealed correspondence with physicians in Avignon, Naples, and Strasbourg, all cities suffering major plague outbreaks. While no direct evidence proved these physicians were conducting similar experiments, the letters discussed research methodologies and controlled observation techniques in language that suggested Vogel might have been part of a broader network of medical researchers pushing ethical boundaries. Most controversial was Vogel's correspondence with a brother Thaddeus in Prague, which detailed theories about plague transmission that were remarkably accurate for the time. These letters suggested Vogel had essentially discovered the rat-flea-human transmission vector, a finding that wouldn't be officially recognized until the late 19th century. The ethical catastrophe was that he'd used an entire city as his laboratory to prove his hypothesis. The Council of Krakow faced difficult questions about their own culpability. How had they failed to notice Vogel's activities? Why had no one questioned his bizarre rat collection? Should they have investigated his credentials more thoroughly? A special commission investigated potential negligence by city officials. The commission's report, delivered in January 1349, proved politically sensitive. It concluded that the council had exercised reasonable diligence given medieval standards. Vogel's forged credentials were convincing, and his public work as a physician had been exemplary. However, the report recommended sweeping changes to city administration. First, all foreign physicians seeking to practice in Krakow must now have their credentials verified through direct correspondence with their claimed institutions. Second, any research involving disease must be conducted under supervision of the city's medical college. Third, unusual behaviors or suspicious activities by medical practitioners must be reported to a newly created position, the city medical inspector. These reforms, born from Krakow's trauma, would gradually spread to other Polish cities and eventually influence medical regulation across Central Europe. The human cost of Vogel's experiments proved difficult to calculate precisely. Medieval record-keeping was imperfect, and distinguishing between natural plague deaths and those resulting from Vogel's deliberate infections was often impossible. However, careful analysis of death records by modern historians suggests Vogel's interventions may have caused between 800 and 1,200 additional deaths, beyond what the city would have experienced from ambient plague spread. Entire families were erased. The Jewish quarter lost nearly 40% of its population. The clergy was decimated. Of the cathedral's 52 priests and monks, only 19 survived 1348. The economic impact was severe, with major trading houses collapsing due to loss of personnel and disruption of commerce. Yet Krakow survived, King Casimir, demonstrating the administrative competence that earned him the epithet the Great, provided substantial aid to the city. He temporarily reduced taxes, granted emergency funds for rebuilding, and encouraged immigration to replace lost population. Within 5 years, Krakow had largely recovered, though the psychological scars persisted for generations. The church's response proved particularly complex. Bishop Florian's successor, the cautious and methodical Bishop Jan, conducted a theological investigation into whether Vogel had been possessed by demonic forces or was simply a mortal sinner. The investigation concluded that Vogel represented humanity's capacity for evil when unconstrained by faith and morality, a chilling acknowledgement that monsters need not be supernatural. Most tragically, Rabbi Moshe's murder created a crisis of faith within the Jewish community. Many questioned how God could allow such evil to use friendship and trust as weapons. The community's spiritual recovery proved as difficult as its physical rebuilding. Several families emigrated to other cities, unable to remain in a place that held such bitter memories. The Vogel case sent shockwaves through medieval European society, though its full impact took years to manifest. In the immediate aftermath, cities across Poland and the Holy Roman Empire tightened regulations on foreign physicians. The University of Krakow, established by King Casimir in 1364, created Europe's first formal medical ethics curriculum, a direct response to Vogel's atrocities. But the implications ran far deeper than administrative reforms. Vogel's deliberate weaponization of disease represented something historically unprecedented. While armies had occasionally catapulted plague-infected corpses over castle walls during sieges, Vogel's systematic approach, the careful documentation, the experimental methodology, the use of animal vectors, previewed horrors that wouldn't be fully realized until the 20th century's biological warfare programs. Modern historians studying the Vogel case have drawn disturbing parallels to later medical atrocities. The Nazi doctors who conducted human experiments in concentration camps, the Japanese Unit 731's biological warfare research during World War II, the Tuskegee syphilis study, all share Vogel's fundamental rationalization that scientific knowledge justifies human suffering. In this sense, Dr. Marius Vogel was history's first bioterrorist and a prototype for the rational monster who commits atrocity in the name of research. The case also fundamentally changed medieval thinking about disease. Before Vogel, plague was universally understood as divine punishment, or the result of miasma and corrupted air. Vogel's journals, despite their horrific content, provided evidence that disease could spread through specific vectors in predictable patterns. While his rat flea transmission theory wasn't formally proven until Alexandra Yerson's work in the 1890s, Vogel's observations influenced more progressive physicians to question traditional plague theory. Ironically, the massive data Vogel collected, once stripped of its murderous context, contributed to genuine medical progress. 17th-century physicians studying plague at the University of Krakow had access to Vogel's journals, kept under strict security, and used his detailed progression notes to better understand disease symptoms. His documentation of the 3-day incubation period helped establish more effective quarantine durations. His evidence for person-to-person transmission influenced physicians to implement better isolation protocols. This created an ethical nightmare that scholars still debate. Can knowledge gained through evil means be used for good? Should Vogel's research be credited for later medical advances? The University of Krakow ultimately decided that Vogel's work could be studied but never cited by name, a compromise that acknowledged both the data's value and the source's moral corruption. The Vogel case also influenced legal development. Medieval law struggled with his crimes because they didn't fit existing categories. He wasn't a conventional murderer acting in passion or for personal gain. He wasn't a poisoner in the traditional sense. The novelty of his methods forced legal scholars to develop new frameworks for prosecuting crimes involving disease and biological agents. By the 16th century, legal treatises across Europe referenced the Krakow precedent when discussing crimes involving deliberate disease transmission. These legal developments would eventually influence modern international law regarding biological weapons and medical ethics, including provisions in the Geneva Conventions. Perhaps most significantly, the Vogel case revealed something profound about human nature's dark potential. Here was a man of education and intellect, someone who'd taken oaths to heal the sick, who'd transformed himself into an angel of death through pure rationalization. He didn't hate his victims. Indeed, he seemed to feel nothing for them at all. They were simply data points in his grand experiment. This emotional detachment, this ability to view human suffering as merely raw material for scientific advancement, represents a peculiarly modern form of evil. Vogel anticipated the technocratic killers of later centuries who would commit atrocities while maintaining meticulous record. And publishing research papers, he proved that civilization and education provide no inherent immunity against moral catastrophe. The survivors of Vogel's terror developed what we might now recognize as community trauma. For years afterward, Krakow's citizens reported nightmares about rats, paranoia about plague doctors, and difficulty trusting physicians. Some families refused medical treatment entirely, preferring to trust in prayer rather than risk encountering another Vogel. This medical skepticism persisted for generations, complicating public health efforts during subsequent plague outbreaks. In a broader sense, Vogel's crimes contributed to the growing anxiety that characterized late medieval European society. The 14th century was already an age of crisis: plague, warfare, religious schism, economic disruption. The revelation that trusted authorities might deliberately cause the very disasters they claimed to prevent deepened the era's paranoia and uncertainty. Modern scholars have identified at least 3 other possible cases of deliberate plague infection during the medieval period, all occurring within 20 years of Vogel's discovery. While none approached Vogel's systematic approach, the cases suggest his methods may have inspired imitators. A physician in Strasbourg was executed in 1362 for allegedly infecting his patients to steal their property. A barber surgeon in Prague faced accusations in 1367 of using plague-infected instruments, though he was ultimately acquitted. Most disturbingly, a 1371 trial in Vienna prosecuted a physician who'd kept detailed notes on deliberately infecting rival doctors, notes whose language eerily echoed Vogel's journals. These cases raised troubling questions about how many other medical practitioners might have been conducting similar experiments, but unlike Vogel, were never discovered. The historical record is necessarily incomplete. Medieval authorities had neither the investigative tools nor the conceptual framework to detect such crimes unless evidence was overwhelming. In Krakow itself, the memory of Dr. Vogel became part of local folklore. By the 16th century, parents frightened misbehaving children with warnings that the rat doctor will come for you. The house where Vogel conducted his experiments was torn down in 1372, and the Jewish community performed purification rituals on the site. A small memorial was erected there bearing the names of those known to have died from Vogel's deliberately induced plague outbreaks. That memorial stood for nearly 300 years before being destroyed during the Swedish invasion of 1655. It was never rebuilt. Today, the location is a small park in Krakow's historic district. Few visitors know the site's dark history. There's a certain irony in this forgetting. Vogel sought knowledge that would endure, yet his very name has largely faded from memory while his victims remain anonymous. The ultimate legacy of Dr. Marius Vogel is a cautionary tale. About the corruption of science divorced from ethics, he demonstrated that intelligence and education are tools that amplify human nature rather than improving it. In the hands of someone without moral constraints, medical knowledge became a weapon of unprecedented precision. His case reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that knowledge can be used for evil as easily as good, and that the veneer of civilization is thinner than we'd like to believe. Every generation must choose whether to honor the human dignity of others or sacrifice it on the altar of advancement. Dr. Vogel made his choice. His name deserves to be remembered not as a pioneer of science, but as a warning of what happens when curiosity becomes untethered from conscience. What do you think drove Dr. Marius Vogel to transform healing into murder? Was it pure scientific curiosity, or was there something darker in his psychology? How do we balance using knowledge gained through evil means against the moral cost of acknowledging it? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you found this lost chapter of medieval history as disturbing as we did, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more explorations of humanity's darkest moments. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into the shadows of history. Remember, the past isn't as distant as we'd like to believe. The questions Vogel's case raises about medical ethics, the limits of scientific inquiry, and the nature of evil remain urgently relevant today. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story that history tried to forget,